over the last few years, there's been a lot going on, certainly in the United Kingdom. The National Environment Research Council has funded a number of projects, and one of sort of the bigger initiatives that I've become involved with is the Changing the Environment programme. So it's fantastic to have colleagues from Oxford here who have a programme within this area. There's obviously Cambridge as well. And more recently, just as a result of my own sort of involvement with this, learning about who else is in this field and learning about many other individuals doing great work. So Heiko, So Young, Perspectives, Mohammed, it's just fantastic to have sort of an international panel looking at these sorts of issues. So I'm going to be sort of not talking in detail about technical areas because we have many more skilled people this morning who have that in-depth knowledge in various aspects. We're going to start with Audrey. So Audrey, it's very lovely to have you from the University of Oxford and sharing your insights about some of the work that we might be able to do to help our climate. So over to you.
Okay. Thank you for sharing that first slide with us. There we go. Thank you. Excellent. Okay. In transformation of food systems requires. Okay. Thanks so much for having me. Thanks so much, Sean, for inviting me to this panel. Really excited to be here and grateful to the University of Cambridge for organizing this. So I'm Audrey Wagner from the Nature-Based Solutions Initiative at the University of Oxford, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about nature-based solutions and land and landscapes, of course, going with the theme of the event for net zero and for climate mitigation. So first of all, I wanted to start off by talking, kind of generally setting the scene, talking about landscapes. So landscapes and nature hold many values for society and for people. So these can be thought of as nature's contribution to people, or more kind of commonly known as ecosystem services, right? So these include disaster risk reduction, food security, water security, medicine, cultural value, spiritual value, and of course, the topic of today, climate mitigation. So while this event focuses on landscapes in the context of climate mitigation and net zero, when it comes to land, we can never only consider one element in isolation. So I really kind of wanted to set the scene with that. So we need our landscapes to provide us with food, with livelihoods, with climate adaptation benefits, right? So still helping us fight climate change, but on the adaptation side of things, and to support biodiversity, as well as to help us reach net zero. So, okay, with that kind of scene setting, zooming in a little bit to land and climate change mitigation. So thinking about what are the emissions from the land sector, from the AFOLU sector, the agriculture, forestry, and other land use sectors. So IPCC reports show us that the AFOLU sector is responsible for 21%, the latest report, 21% of global emissions. Half of this is particularly agriculture, and half of it is land use change, right? So we can kind of think about keeping this 21% number in mind, and thinking that, okay, 3/4 of the emission are from fossil fuels, from the energy sector, and we're talking about 25% here. But there are risks of focusing narrowly on land for carbon. So in some cases, the rush for land-based carbon sequestration is resulting in monocultures or afforestation in the wrong places. And an excessive focus on tree planting, for instance, can result in maladaptation. So can really actually harm adaptation efforts. And there are also risks of replacing critical ecosystems such as wetlands, such as peatlands and grasslands. And there are also risks, as an example, in terms of scaling up effects, there's risks for displacing food production. I know some of the other speakers are going to go into this more in the future. So there's a potential for this to have impacts on food security and on biodiversity. So if we want to have solutions from the land, we need to do it right? Given all the risks that I spoke about on the last slide. So studies have shown that even if you are only interested in carbon, you don't get those mitigation benefits without the biodiversity. Biodiversity leads to higher carbon sequestration and storage, and also it contributes critically to resilience, right? Because otherwise, if you don't have that biodiversity, if you're trying to store carbon, it might just all go up in smoke. So really interesting, really important having that biodiversity. And you don't get your carbon benefits also without community buy-in and the meaningful, genuine involvement of Indigenous peoples and local communities. So that brings us the question kind of asking on this slide, we need to do it right. Okay, what is right? What are we talking about here? So this is where I segue into talking about nature-based solutions, which is a way of managing landscapes to kind of get these benefits with mitigating these risks, right? So nature-based solutions involve working with nature to address societal challenges, providing benefits for both human well-being and biodiversity. So we see in this diagram over here, nature-based solutions written in black, and then we have people working with nature in the white, and then you have the yellow arrows going out, and then you have all of these this writing in blue that talks about the ecosystem services, right? That nature is providing, so coastal defense, greenhouse gas reduction, et cetera. And then these ecosystem services are feeding into human well-being and biodiversity and sustainable development. Critically, though, we can see that we have biodiversity twice in this diagram. So we have nature-based solutions contributing to supporting biodiversity, but we also have biodiversity at the bottom of the diagram. And what that represents is that you don't get these benefits without biodiversity. Biodiversity is really underpinning the provision of these benefits of nature-based solutions. It is at the base of nature-based solutions. So let's get a bit more tangible here. What do nature-based solutions involve? So they involve protection, so the conservation of existing ecosystems. So for instance, land titling to protect Indigenous territories, or to empower them to then protect their own territories, of course. Restoration, so restoring destroyed or degraded landscapes, management, so improved management, sustainable management of land and resources. So this can include agroforestry, agroecology, regenerative agriculture, etc. And it can also include the creation of new ecosystems. So for instance, when we're talking about urban areas, this would be creating new green ecosystems. Although I've already explained what nature-based solutions is, I'm going to give you the kind of full definition that was agreed upon at UNEA, the UN Environment Assembly in 2002, which is a multilaterally agreed upon definition. So it's really critical. It's a bit long, but I will read out the whole thing now. So nature-based solutions are actions to protect, conserve, restore, sustainably use and manage natural or modified terrestrial, freshwater, coastal, and marine ecosystems, which address social, economic, and environmental challenges effectively and adaptively, while simultaneously providing human well-being, ecosystem services, and resilience biodiversity benefits. So I've bolded, it's definitely a mouthful, we're at a COP here, so this is how, these texts that are multilaterally agreed upon work. Each word is of course argued upon, so quite a mouthful. But I've highlighted some parts that I really wanted to emphasize here. So nature-based solutions must, by definition, provide human well-being benefits and biodiversity benefits. So if they do not provide these, then they should not be considered a nature-based solution, and that's really critical. Going in, emphasizing the point about biodiversity here. So again, to qualify as an NBS, an action must support or enhance biodiversity. And so the NBS concept is based on the science and knowledge that healthy biodiverse ecosystems produce a diverse range of ecosystem services, right? This is where we're getting all the benefits, and it's from those ecosystems being healthy and being biodiverse. And so biodiversity is not just a co-benefit. We're really moving away from this language of co-benefits. NBS, biodiversity is a necessary precondition underpinning the successful provisioning of benefits. Nature-based solutions are also key, very important for people, right? They are for people and by people working with nature as part of nature. So really kind of breaking that human nature dichotomy. So we must recognize that humans and nature are not separate, recognize the plurality of values that nature holds for people, that land holds for people, right? Going back to my first slide. And we must understand that the extent to which nature or land brings benefits depends on how we implement nature-based solutions. So really all about the how. Okay, going back to the topic of climate mitigation. So nature-based solutions can help us mitigate climate change. So we talked first about that it's 21% now, 2022, 21. So nature-based solutions can help reduce the 22% of greenhouse gases from the AFOLU sector. And nature-based solutions can also help to go beyond this, to go beyond reductions, and possibly help with greenhouse gas removals. But here we need to be really careful with overestimation. So there's many limitations, and further warming, so further climate change, further global warming, compromises the performance and the potential of this. Okay. Sorry, I might go a bit over time. Okay, so looking at some of the latest studies on estimating the potential for nature-based solutions to provide climate mitigation. So this is a study from Girardin et al., our colleague at the University of Oxford here, and it was found that nature-based solutions can provide up to 10 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent reduction mitigation benefits per year, with if they are kind of maximized. So this is a maximum number and including safeguard. And critically, we have the breakdown over here. So about half of that is avoided emissions, half of that is enhanced things. And then key to point out that that protection is about 40% of that. So a really big chunk. Protection is very key. Management is also a big chunk. And then we have restoration, which many people are very excited about, and it has a very important potential, but it's only 20% of this potential. So just to kind of keep that in mind and be kind of realistic about the potential of restoration and kind of not forgetting the importance of protection. This study goes on to find that nature-based solutions mitigation potential is equivalent to shaving off 0.3 degrees off of peak warming by 2085, but this is only if we decarbonize and only if we protect the carbon in our intact ecosystem. So I think a lot of people tend to want to go towards percentages, right? And yes, we provide this percentage of our mitigation potential, and that can be problematic for several ways because it doesn't refer to, for instance, the timelines. So until which time for is it just until 2030, etc. And it also doesn't have that caveat that it's only if we decarbonize. So we like to think about it more in terms of temperature, shaving off 0.3 degrees by this date. But again, really important that caveat only if we decarbonize. So the capacity of land-based mitigation potential is finite, as I said, and further warming really compromises potential. So we need to emphasize that delaying decarbonization could turn our ecosystems from net sinks into net sources. One other thing I wanted to bring in here is that, so I showed the global mitigation potential, but what can be really important is looking kind of zooming in a bit more and looking at the regional and the national mitigation potential of nature-based solutions for land. So for some countries, the potential is quite small and maybe it's not so relevant for them to focus on it. But for some countries, big biodiverse countries, Indonesia, Brazil, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the potential for NBS to reach their NDCs is huge. And this is what my colleague Alina is going to talk about right after me. So I'll let her kind of go more into that after me. So there are risks to mitigation, to the NBS potential for mitigation, and how do we minimize these risks? What are they? So there's biophysical risks, so fire, pests, droughts, right? These ecosystems, losing the carbon that we're hoping that they will store. But there's also important risks on the governance side of things, on the human system side of things. So these can involve financial failure, management failure. So for instance, illegal harvesting not being kept under control. Policy changes, economic is super important. So for instance, global food price changes can really affect these things. So we need to think about it as an interconnected global system, of course. To mitigate these risks, so for the biophysical risks, again, going back to biodiversity can help with resilience to these biophysical risks that we're talking about. As well, interventions based on sound science can help mitigate these risks. What do I mean by that? So for instance, for the biophysical risks, we need to think about right species, right place. We need to think about, okay, what do the models show that climate change will kind of do to this area in the future? And are these species that we're planting appropriate now and also future-proof, right? So they need to be based on science. And as well, for the governance risk, good governance can help minimize these risks, but what does good governance mean? Of course, that's a whole big question. And again, a lot of social science is being done on that. So also to refer to sound science for the social side of things as well. And so there's a key role for natural science research and social science research going forward. A little bit more on the governance and human risks to NBS potential. So participatory and inclusive and equitable governance of NBS is really key to ensuring the permanence of NBS, right? We're interested in the permanence, but we really need to think about what aspects affect this permanence. And equitable governance is one of these. So local community buy-in and participation in the design, implementation, monitoring is crucial for the longevity and the success of any projects that we're trying to implement. And there's a very, very high importance, I'm sure, as we all know here, of Indigenous peoples and local communities. So study after study has shown that the lowest rates of forest loss have been on Indigenous land. And so this, of course, points to the importance of, again, if we're only interested in carbon, even if we're only interested in carbon, we need to focus on these things. But of course, that should not be the only reasons why we're focusing on these things. It is the right thing to do. Equity, justice, climate justice reasons as well. We need to be clear that nature-based solutions are not a substitute for decarbonization and not an alternative to technological solutions. So we need technology to decarbonize the energy sector, aviation, shipping, industry, transport, all of these things, right? And we need a combination of engineered and nature-based solutions to adapt to climate change. So we can't see NBS as a silver bullet, but we really need the full, fast, fair, and funded phase out of all fossil fuels if we are to get any of these benefits. Nature-based solutions can bring multiple benefits, and we're really, again, trying to move away from the language of co-benefits to core benefits, moving away from the dominant idea of carbon sequestration being the primary benefit and biodiversity and others being kind of side benefits. Of course, that isn't appropriate. And nature-based solutions can help unite the multilateral conventions like the UNFCCC, where we are right now, but also the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity, because it provides this whole kind of wide range of benefits. At COP28, we're focusing a lot on the synergies between climate and biodiversity. So we know that climate change and biodiversity share many of the same drivers. For instance, of course, land use change. We know that climate change is a driver of biodiversity loss. We know that limiting climate change, of course, can help us minimize biodiversity loss, and that tackling biodiversity loss can in turn help solve climate change. So many kind of interlinkages here. But some actions aimed at tackling climate change may harm biodiversity. So for instance, if we want to plant monocultures of the fastest, most efficient growing tree, this would not be good for biodiversity. So there's really a need for safeguards and for thinking about how can we enhance the synergies while managing and minimizing those potential trade-offs. And at COP28 here, we need explicit mention of these interlinkages and of this need for safeguards and in the GST, in the global stocktake. And we really are pushing for including mentioning the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework in the text to make an explicit linkage between the two conventions. We've written up a primer on this. You can go into it if you like, particularly on these kind of synergies for COP28. My last slide here, sorry, I'm really sorry about overtime. So these are our 4 principles for guiding nature-based solutions. So number 1, summary slide, number 1, NBS are not a substitute for the rapid phase out of fossil fuels, and they must not delay urgent action to decarbonize our economies. Number 2, NBS involve a wide range of different ecosystems. So it's not only about planting trees and forests, we're talking also about aquatic systems, about managing our working lands. Number 3, NBS are designed, implemented, managed, and monitored by or in very close partnership with Indigenous peoples and local communities through a process that fully respects and champions local rights, knowledge, and that generates local benefits. And lastly, NBS must support or enhance biodiversity. So thank you very much for having me. Sorry for going over time, but I hope that set the scene for the rest of the event. Thanks.
Audrey, thank you ever so much indeed. So I'm really taken with the introduction to the overall setting, but also a very key message, which is actually, although we're here at COP28, we're caring about the climate. It's not just in this area, but there are other approaches, solutions, which actually the climate's it is the co-benefit of doing something else for the right reasons. And it's not just in nature. It might be looking at some of the technical solutions. It might be actually just swapping out fossil fuel infrastructure for fossil fuel free energy, because the fossil fuel free energy is cheaper, and that's the reason you're going to do it. And the benefits to the climate, well, thank you very much. We're going to put that in the back. But a very, very key sort of message also with these nature-based solutions. We're now going to go and take a case study, and we're going to go and look a little bit more detail, as Audrey mentioned, into Brazil. So Eline, also from the University of Oxford, thank you so much for joining us this morning. We look forward to your words. So I'm just going to bring up your slides. It's like who knows up.
Hi everyone, good morning. I'm Aline Giovanni. I'm a research fellow in nature-based solutions and Oxford Net Zero initiatives based in the Department of Biology of Oxford University. And now I'm gonna talk about a case study. Let's deep dive into Brazil. And basically I'll be sharing the key messages from this study where we investigated the mitigation potential of nature-based solutions in Brazil's net zero pathways. So I've led this study with several colleagues from different institutions, Brazilian institutions, Oxford, and even Khalifa University here in Dubai. Brazil in a nutshell. So Brazil is a mega diverse country. It's home from 15 to 20% of Earth's biological diversity, 60% of the Amazon. But it also has high deforestation levels. It ranks number in terms of deforestation, tropical deforestation. And Brazil is also a major global producer and exporter of agricultural commodities. And agriculture is the main direct or indirect driver of deforestation in Brazil. And Brazil is also a top emitter. It ranks number 6. And emissions in Brazil, and here is the emissions profile. It mainly comes from land use. land use and agriculture. While globally, 3/4 of emissions are energy related, in Brazil, almost 3/4 are land use related, with deforestation being the single largest source of emissions in the country. Almost half comes from deforestation. And in terms of energy, the energy sector has a huge share of renewables when we compare to other sectors, mainly hydro. And we have to remember that energy security is also connected to ecosystem services in Brazil. So to keep this clean energy sector in Brazil, we need to protect and restore nature. Okay, so our research question was, how can Brazil reach its net zero pledge in the future? And to do that, we are using models. So we designed a regional integrated assessment modeling approach. We are combining a land use model for the land use and agricultural sectors, and another model for the other sectors, energy, industrial processes, and waste. And what I do, I'm a mathematician by background, so I work with these models. So we do scenarios modeling for policy evaluation. And why we need numbers? Numbers are important because they can guide policy decisions. So we need numbers. We need to bring quantitative numbers to policy discussion. And what models or modelers do? We do scenarios. So for this study, we always have a baseline scenario. And in the case of Brazil, since we are using a regional integrated assessment modeling approach, we are really designing scenarios taking into account national policies like the Forest Code, which is an important policy in terms of land use in Brazil. It's about eliminating illegal deforestation and also promoting native vegetation restoration. We also created another scenario. So first we have the baseline. On top of baseline, we have the Forest Code. On top of the Forest Code, we add things, and then we have the Forest Code Plus. And at the end, we also designed net zero scenarios. No time to discuss the details of those scenarios, but if you have questions, please approach me anytime. So then one question for us is this one: how national policies can contribute to Brazil's net zero pathways. So let's look emissions. So here in this graph, we have historical emissions, net GHG emissions coming from government initiative, like official numbers, and also from an independent system. And we also have the targets, NDC targets. The study was released before Brazil updated its NDC. So I must say that the NDC that was submitted to the UNEP just before COP28 takes into account now the purple marks for 2025 and 2030, and the net zero goal in 2050. And this linear path is just a reference here. So then we took our baseline scenario, considering policies in all sectors, and this is what is likely to happen in terms of emissions in the future, according to our baseline that captures a weak governance. So our modeling approach is saying that in the future, the emissions tend to be flat, and as you can see, there is a huge gap to net zero. And in this baseline, our models are projecting 64 million hectares of deforestation, which is a huge area, and no restoration. But then moving from base to a new future, let's say the Forest Code. If the Forest Code is fully implemented in Brazil, what would happen? So we move from 64 million hectares to 32, and from zero restoration to 13 million hectares. And in terms of emissions, what would happen if we have the Forest Code, a legislation that dates back to the 60s, that has never been fully enforced? It's super challenging to implement Forest Code in Brazil, but if it's fully implemented, and we can test this question in models, it would reduce the gap to net zero by only 38%. So net zero is pretty challenging. This is one key message. Forest code is more than enough for the short-term targets, 2025 and 2030, but not enough for net zero. So then we need a discussion to align short-term action, ambition, and long-term trajectories. This is one thing. Okay, let's move beyond the forest code and design a scenario where we eliminate deforestation and we triple restoration. In this case, again, it's not enough to bridge the net zero gap, but the good part is Brazil can stay on a clear path to net zero for the next 20 years, but not enough. So then we move to another type of scenarios. Now we have a goal. The net zero is the goal. And what would happen in Brazil to achieve net zero? So by construction, we create this scenario. So this one is on top of the forest code. So as you can see here, we go to net zero. And in this type of scenario, the goal is not the interesting part, but what was needed to achieve the goal. So then we measure what was the potential of different activities. So if Brazil decides to go to net zero through implementing forest code now and then letting other sectors to bridge the gap, basically the energy sector to bridge the gap to net zero. And since the energy sector in Brazil is already, let's say, clean, because it has a high share of renewables, it means that the energy sector will have to deploy negative emissions technologies such as BECCS. For the Brazilian case, BECCS is more likely to happen. And BECCS, as Audrey mentioned, it might have detrimental impacts on biodiversity. And another point of BECCS is that it's expensive. It's costly technology, not yet mature. And in this pathway, Brazil can reach net zero, but it will be super costly. So there is an alternative future. If Brazil prioritizes nature-based solutions through eliminating deforestation, illegal and legal, and promoting large-scale native vegetation restoration, high integrity, the country can stay 20 years without the need to deploy negative emissions technologies that are expensive. And it will be less costly. And Brazil can make, nature-based solutions can make almost 80% of the potential. And the final question for us was, okay, so Brazil doesn't implement nature-based solutions, that doesn't deal with deforestation, restoration, and just let the energy sector to decarbonize or to reach net zero. What would happen here? Our modeling approach said that there is no solution. So there is no way for Brazil to achieve net zero without nature. We need nature-based solutions, and it's because of Brazil's emissions profile. So it's really, really at the heart of Brazil's net zero pledge. It needs nature. So summarizing, the key messages are, so first, there is no credible net zero pathway in Brazil without nature-based solutions, particularly ending deforestation and also promoting native vegetation restoration. It's not monocultures, afforestation, no, native vegetation restoration. NBS, as I said, numbers, they are important to guide policy. So in this work, we provided quantitative numbers to our discussion. So NBS could mitigate nearly 80% of Brazil's net zero pledge and keep the country in a clear path to net zero for the next 20 years. So no need to reinvent the wheel. Just do what it's possible to do. It's not easy, it's challenging, but as Audrey pointed in her speech, there are many benefits, multiple benefits nature can provide. It's not about mitigation, but also adaptation and resilience. National policies, the ones that are on table, they are not enough. There is a need to go beyond. Net zero, for example, is not in the national policy for climate change. So we also push for that. There is a need to incorporate net zero in national policies in Brazil. There is also a need to have an NBS in the global stock take text, in the NDCs. It's super important. And finally, A credible net zero pathway in Brazil grounded in NBS will enable Brazil to play a leading role in climate and biodiversity. But if Brazil wants to be a leader, it has to be an example first. Thank you.
Alina, thank you ever so much indeed. Goodness me. And we'll come on to this in the discussions, but of course, as already mentioned, the risks that we already have with as climate change outside of potentially Brazil's control, the risks to places like the Amazon and actually increased emissions just as a result of the changes that we might see. So we're going to now take on the thread to do with bioenergy carbon capture storage that Alina mentioned, and we're now going to follow that with So-Young perspectives. So-Young, it'd be great to hear your thoughts on this potential sort of vehicle for emission reduction through displacement of fossil fuels, as well as, of course, ultimately removal as well. So I'm going to bring up your slides for you.
And perhaps during the step ones, what is certain I want to do,
Good morning, everyone. My name is So-Young. I'm a second-year PhD student at the Fletcher School, Tufts University, and I also work at Perspectives Climate Research. And my colleague Olivia here will also present on our best to impacts during our presentation. So in my presentation, I'm going to explain CDR briefly and BECCS, and in particular, I'm going to focus on trade-offs between BECCS and NBS, and Olivia will cover carbon accounting and the emissions. So what is carbon dioxide removal? I'm sure many of you already know about this, but I wanted to show you this graph from IPCC report that by 2100 to achieve net negative, we need both removals of managed land and other removals. What do you mean by other removals? There are a couple of examples, including BECCS, bioenergy, with CCS and direct air capture. There could be biochar and other examples. But as you can see, the lighter orange color would be other removals. So the ratio between the nature-based solutions and the engineered solutions would be almost 1-to-1 or even more. So it suggests the need for other removals going forward. However, when we look at the existing capacity of this renewable CDR, it is extremely low. As you can see here, very thin bar there compared to conventional CDR managed methods on land, which would be nature-based solutions, is almost 1,000 times smaller for noble CDR compared to nature-based solutions, suggesting that it needs to scale up to achieve the goals that we're hoping to, we're looking at. So what is BECCS exactly? I brought this figure from IPCC report again to illustrate the case for BECCS. And it shows that for BECCS, you basically capture CO2 when you're burning biomass for energy purposes. And so you sequester it afterwards in geological storage. And so the permanence would be higher if you maintain the sequestration process in the long term. So as a result, even if you produce energy with the biomass, you will be able to achieve the net negative result afterwards. I found this table very helpful to understand the difference between afforestation, reforestation, and BECCS. And of course, there are other examples such as biochar and soil carbon sequestration, but I'm going to focus on these two. for this presentation. And so as you can see, potential sequestration rate by 2050 and 2100 for these two approaches are very different, especially by 2100. As Alina mentioned in her presentation, we need both BECCS and nature-based solutions, as the potential rate is much higher for BECCS, given that BECCS is less vulnerable to external disturbances such as wildfires compared to trees. It provides an advantage for permanence. And also, of course, the cost for afforestation is much cheaper, much lower than BECCS. Even by 2050, the model expected that it would still be quite pricey, so you would need policy support to lower the cost. So what's needed for BECCS? I gave examples of trees, which would be the first example, wood tree stocks. That is the most common approach right now, but it has implications for feedstocks availability and land water requirements. So it is increasingly explored in different ways. So municipal solid waste, for example, would be an example for new BECCS type. So that would be used as an input for waste to energy facilities. So that could be another approach that we can look at, which I will further discuss in the slides. So how major is BECCS? According to the first edition of State of CDR report, it shows that the technology readiness level of BECCS is between 5 to 6. It means that the technology is mature and demonstrated, but the system is not readily available. So for CCS, you need carbon storage, transport, and all the infrastructure technology, so it is not something easy to be implemented. So the examples I brought here are the ones in the United States and in Sweden. And on the left, it is an ethanol plant that was retrofitted with CCS. And on the right, it is on the left, sorry, the Stockholm Exergi that also retrofitted from existing hidden power biomass plants. Oh, and I also want to mention that the technology is being demonstrated in multiple places, but this one in the United States is one of the largest scale facility, and there aren't that many large scale as of now. I think this slide is the key message for this presentation. So trade-offs between vaccine and nature-based solutions. So first of all, as previous presenters mentioned, the using biomass for energy with CCS has implications for carbon sequestration potential. As we are using trees as feedstocks for BECCS, we are losing the carbon sink that trees can sequester. So that would be harmful for maintaining biodiversity as well. And some scholars have mentioned that the carbon uptake of aging trees and young trees are different, so the potential can be differentiated, but also having a sustainable forest management is not an easy task to monitor, verify, and report. So it's always challenging to accurately verify that. And secondly, limited feedstocks. As we're thinking to accelerate the scale of BECCS, we need to extend the need for feedstocks. However, it would be challenging to do so, given that we're mostly using wood and the ones that would have implications for land water requirements. And lastly, land use changes and conversion losses. As we're converting grassland or forest to energy crops, it would be difficult to maintain that sustainability issues as we are accelerating BECCS. I'll skip this slide. So what is the way forward for BECCS? As I mentioned, using wood or the ones that we need for nature-based solutions has harmful implications for nature-based solutions. So you're increasingly looking at waste derived feedstocks to have more sustainable solutions. So that could be waste to energy with CCS. There are a couple of demonstrations around the world, but it is not the focus of the policy and also the focus of the investors. So yeah, but I wanted to give a key message here that not all BECs have the same implications for sustainability, and so we need to differentiate the different types. So yeah, Olivia will explain the next following slides.
Apologies for the insert text here blocker that I've obviously missed. So yeah, slightly veering off into a different direction here, but equally important, is that one of the critical challenges for BECS and MBS related removals is that it's difficult to determine whether mitigation has actually occurred. As specifically results can vary between emission reductions and removals and can of course depend on the activity and project type as well. With regards to forestry-based projects, there are national and regional differences, for instance, in the types of forests that grow, the types of plants and trees that grow, so as well as the diversity of forest growth, and then of course the capacities of each country to be able to track and monitor those changes as well. So what this tells us is that there's a need for robust MRV to ensure that the carbon stored is accurately accounted for, and emphasizes also the consistency that's needed across national greenhouse gas level accounting. But carbon accounting is incredibly time intensive at the moment. It's also really complex, and there's a very, very high cost associated with tracking carbon storage and leakage, importantly, over time. MRV processes also, so they provide accounting and measurement of impact, which is crucial for establishing legitimacy of any project. But the problem is that traditional MRV costs are so high, and also that initiatives and small projects often can't afford these high costs. In terms of verification, it can sometimes take several years to process. And most stakeholders, especially those that are part of Indigenous communities, will never receive the funding actually that they need in order to verify these projects. So many remain stagnant. So ultimately, centralized MRV is actually a siloed, closed system and actually very highly restrictive and particularly biased. But digital MRV, so this is Web3 technology and blockchain technology, can actually help simplify this process. There's monitoring and verification specifically. It can also provide traceable and decentralized records that carbon credits can be associated with the permanent removal and storage of carbon. It also can improve access for these local communities and help with pricing because of the greater transparency across the whole process itself. Overall, it can then serve to make nature-based projects more fair, inclusive, and efficient overall. So to summarize, from both Soyoung's presentation and mine, we have a variation in political pressures across diverse geographies and countries, and that specifically public policy on BECS tends to be very tech agnostic, focusing on that kind of market competition. Digital MRV, as I just mentioned, can provide higher scrutiny, improved access and pricing, which I think is crucial for the longevity of ensuring carbon removed is stored and remains there. That's everything.
Olivia, thank you ever so much indeed. So with the topic of MRV, which often is associated with the removal space, certainly in the oceans area, but actually there are bigger problems regarding just actually accounting, even for emissions. And therefore, we're going to hear from Mohammed now, thinking about the sort of technologies and the approaches in terms of sensing that we might be able to apply to further our understanding and knowledge base regarding not just the removal space, but also on actually how much we're emitting and what we can do to reduce those emissions. So, Mohammed, over to you. Do you have any story?
or some land use.
So now we rest over to you.
Right. So if we cannot detect something, if we cannot even dream about mitigating it. And so this presentation is more on a global north idea of how Canada's land is changing. And if you know anything about Canada, it's definitely the same area. Unfortunately, we also have a lot of emissions, particularly in the energy sector. So that tops the charts in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, followed by the transport sector. But unsurprisingly, the agricultural sector is coming in third. And in fact, this has increased to 10% in 2021. So we see this trend of increasing agricultural emissions. And typically, we look at why this trend is increasing, particularly in Canada. The idea of land use change, land cover, and forestry means whatever is having human activity, whatever forested lands in Canada have this human activity, is termed as managed lands. And you see on the top left picture there, you can see that roughly 40% of Canada is forested land. But of that, more than half is with human intervention or human activity. Unfortunately, people may think that green means carbon sequestration. There was actually a study done in China which looked at 2.5 worth of Dubai covered in green. So that's 9 kilo hectares of green space, could only offset 6 megatons of CO2. This was an empirical study, so they ignored vegetation type and a lot of other details. And optimistically, we thought that Canada's majority of forested lands would be a carbon sink. Unfortunately, in recent times, we found that the managed lands have turned from being a sink to a source. And you can see that around 78 megatons of CO2 almost doubled, more than doubled in the next year, particularly because of wildfires, the pine beetle infestations, and also the droughts and temperature rise that we're seeing across the globe. So this begs the question, what do we do with such land that is A, polluting our environment in terms of being a carbon source, and B, 40% of Canada? And so people may think, let's try to look at agriculture. Now, the problem with agriculture is that there's a lot of emissions based on fertilizer application. There's natural emissions from the soil due to microbial activity. And the biggest one yet, can anyone guess? Hint, it's an animal. Methane and carbon, exactly. So unfortunately, 10% of total emissions in the agricultural sector, from that, 2/3 is methane, and only 1/3 is nitrous oxide. And that methane is actually 30% of the sector's Canada's greenhouse gas emissions. So we know that methane is the primary culprit here in terms of sensing and mitigation, followed by nitrous oxide. So why should we look at these greenhouse gases in addition to the reason above? Is particularly because of the GWP, or the global warming potential. We know that nitrous oxide warms the atmosphere 273 times more than the baseline of CO2, and methane is roughly 80 times over a 100-year time scale. So the idea is, if we can start detecting nitrous oxides, we can apply those learnings to the similar greenhouse gas in nature, methane. So the industry is very smart, and so they have investigated a couple of sensors to do this. The first one is the electrochemical. This typically has 2 electrodes sandwiching an electrolyte, and they have ion exchange. That ion exchange is proportional to how much gas is detected. The problem is these sensors have a fluid inside the electrolyte, and this is unable to withstand very harsh temperatures, limiting the applicability of these. The second is the non-dispersive infrared, a fancy term for saying if you shine light, if it's a greenhouse gas, it'll absorb the infrared radiation And so if you have a detector at the other end and an emitter at one end, you can actually check how much of the light was absorbed, and that's proportional to the concentration of the gas detected. Now, unfortunately, I'm a student. My budget is not that high. And so the industry felt the same. This is pretty expensive technology, especially if you want to employ it on an agricultural wide landscape. And so we come to the underdog, which is the chemi-resistant metal oxide sensor. Now, these aren't the best in the industry. They're typically a sensing material, the metal oxide, held together by some support and then heated. So the heater is just an activation mechanism for detecting these gases. Unfortunately, there's a lot of work being done to try and improve this technology. And so the question is, if we are talking about agriculture, can we sensitively, selectively, and with energy efficient, the mindset of energy efficiency, detect these greenhouse gases, nitrous oxide and methane? So the solution we came up with is, in terms of sensitivity and selectivity, that depends on the choice of the material you use for sensing the gas. And what we could definitely target first off is the cost and energy savings. So if we remove the heater, which has up to 1 watt of power per sensor, and we replaced it with another method to activate it, in this case, ultraviolet radiation, you could achieve photoactivation, making sure that the metal oxide layer is active enough for sensitive detection, but also saving up to 100 times in order of magnitude the power. So one UV LED could be as small as 1 milliwatt, but even less in terms of power. So we did definitely target cost and energy savings. And the next part is sensitivity and selectivity. So for a lot of the engineering folks, please don't grill me with tough questions because I have not had my defense yet. But I will try to keep this simple in terms of mechanism. So if you expose a sensor like the metal oxide one to, let's say, a mixture of oxygen and nitrous oxide gases, you will find that the ones closest to the surface get adsorbed. There's an electronic interaction. And eventually there's an equilibrium established by the amount of gas molecules adsorbed on the surface and the ones in the atmosphere. Now, on the surface, we find that so the nitrous oxide has many resonance structures. This is the most stable, where you have the NN triple bond followed by the NO single bond. Now, we know that single bonds are easier to cleave, and that's what happens. The oxygen atom sees the electrons, adsorbs onto it as O minus, and the N2 leaves off as nitrogen gas. The idea of our sensing film here is to hold that O minus as long as possible so that we can see how much of nitrous oxide actually got absorbed by measuring how much electrons were locked up by the oxygen ions. So this is more of a resistive sensor, where the number of electrons that got locked up in place because of the oxygens being adsorbed gives us a sense of how much nitrous oxide is actually in the atmosphere. Now, all of this actually happens on the size of my fingertip. So that's the sensor. And the sensing film is transparent in this case. And this connection, so this sensor is typically up to a minute in response time and a minute in recovery time. And I give you real-time data on how much nitrous oxide, for example, is there in the atmosphere. And yeah, you can see the student level soldering skills up there. So yeah, this is a work in progress, clearly. So what does this look like in the field? You can see on the y-axis something called sensitivity response. So this is how you measure whether it's a good material or not. The higher the response, the better. Now, if we were to expose our sensing film, in this case, we chose pristine tin oxide, so that's just a metal oxide. We're doing much more research on the mixed metal oxides composites. And we expose it to our target gas, which is nitrous oxide, and eventually methane. You can see that the sensor starts responding to it. And then when we turn it off, it goes to immediate recovery. And eventually, upon subsequent runs, the reading stabilizes. So the idea is we are able to detect nitrous oxide, so that's a plus point. But the negative point is it takes a while to get to stability. So that being said, there are a lot of metal oxides that we have found that are better than pristine tin oxide, and it's under progress. But the idea is to apply this to the agricultural sector, not only for nitrous oxide emissions, but also methane emissions. So that's from livestock and also from the agricultural land use. And it actually has a major safety component as well. So methane is combustible, unfortunately, and it is a good energy carrier, but if leaked within the atmosphere, could pose a potential significant health risk. And yeah, if there are any collaborators out there, we'd love to get involved in terms of photo technology. But in terms of land use in Canada, the agricultural scene is increasing drastically, and so are the emissions. And so if we cannot sense them, we are unable to mitigate them. Thank you.
I'm sure we're going to come back to actually a key theme of what, if you don't measure it, you don't manage it. So I know we don't actually just mean manage, but certainly intervening to change our behaviours. We're now going to conclude the technical talks with Professor Heiko Balzer from the University of Leicester. So Heiko, over to you.
Thank you very much, Sean, and thank you for the invitation to the panel today. I want to just talk a little bit about climate action through multifunctional landscapes. And this is a perspective I've built up over the years through my leadership of the Landscape Decisions Program and some other related research programs. The Landscape Decisions Program is the UK RI investment, UK Research and Innovation investment of £10.5 million. It's coming to an end in February. And it funded 70 individual research projects in 3 main work packages. And those include mathematical sciences. How can mathematics be adapted to understand what landscapes can deliver? Environmental modeling, and landscapes and communities. So it really cut across disciplinary boundaries. My job role is I work at the University of Leicester, and I'm now director of the new institute I founded about a year ago, which is called the Institute for Environmental Futures. You can look this up on the web to find out more about us. My talk sits in the context of the broader current policies that worldwide fall short of the Paris goal, as we all know. And we are currently heading towards something like 2.7, 2.8 degrees global warming worldwide, expected, despite all the policies and actions that have already been pledged. Where we want to be is 1.5 degrees, although now there is increasing doubt whether we can still achieve that. So, likelihood, I think, the most optimistic scenario that the Climate Action Tracker group has come up with is 1.8 degrees now. So when people ask me in public engagement events, members of the public ask me sometimes, is it too late to do something? Should we just stop worrying about climate change? And my answer is always, no, of course not, because it doesn't matter hugely whether we are ending up at 1.8 degrees or 2.8 degrees or even more. So it's never too late to take action. The slogan on the wall over there says as much. We did not act enough yesterday, but let's start today. Let's do it now. So in that context, unfortunately, the United Kingdom, where I'm from, actually is classed as insufficient now by the Climate Action Tracker ratings. So the policies by the UK altogether are not seen as sufficient to get the world on the path towards less than 1.8, 1.5 degrees global warming anymore. And that's a combination of multiple different factors. But I want to here concentrate on land use and forestry as a possible lever to get us back on track towards adequate climate policies in the United Kingdom. You will see on this slide the net zero target in the UK of getting to net zero by 2050 is actually an acceptable target. So we are on the right track legally, but in the UK we do not have the policies and the actions to implement the policies in place to get us there in a credible way at this point in time. However, there is a lot of research going on into finding options how that can be achieved. And why land use and forestry here at the bottom right of this rating is seen as not significant by the climate action tracker assessment of the United Kingdom. I should say that first of all, land use and forestry needs to be seen in the context of agricultural emissions. And agricultural emissions in the UK actually contribute something over 10% to the overall emissions. So although, as they say, not significant in this chart, land use and forestry and agriculture can play a major role in achieving net zero, although it's not sufficient by itself. The total UK emissions weighted by global warming potential by sector are shown on this chart here to the year of 2021. And what shows you is primarily the emission sources in the UK, in the energy sector. That's by far the biggest source of emissions, followed by industrial processes, and then agriculture and wastes. And use, land exchange and forestry as a separate category. It's just a tiny sliver on those charts. It's also one of the most uncertain estimates in this chart, I should say. So there's been a lot of debate in recent years about the national greenhouse gas inventory of peatlands. And the UK, a few years ago, recalculated its entire emission estimates in the light of new emission factors from peatland, especially drained peatland and agriculturally used peatland, which turned out to be much higher than we thought before. So new data, new measurements can change emission factors and can lead to a better understanding of the mitigation options. That's one message to take away, I think. Now, there are various different land use policy recommendations that have been made over time. And while this slide does not show current policy commitments, it shows policy recommendations. I think it is a very interesting summary chart to illustrate the range of options that the UK is considering. This is a report, Land Use Policies for Net Zero UK, that came from the Committee on Climate Change in 2020. And it suggested, based on research that the Climate Change Committee had done, that UK needs to increase low carbon farming practices for soils and livestock. So methane emissions and greenhouse gas emissions from ruminants, cows and sheep primarily, are one of the major sources from the agriculture sector. And we need to think about increasing annual tree planting to between 90 and 120 million trees, equivalent to about 30,000 hectares per year. We're a long way from that target. There are lots of tree planting initiatives in the UK, but we are not getting to that target quickly. And it is actually complicated by the fact that in the UK, the planting structure of the forest land that we have currently is such that many of the trees, conifer plantations that were planted after the Second World War, are coming up to harvest age now. So when we look at remote sensing data from space, we can actually see that a bigger area of trees is being cut and harvested because it comes to the harvesting age. Then it's being planted in certain time periods, depending on how you define your assessment period. So the goal is there, but it's complicated by the structure, the age structure of the tree plantations in the UK, how we achieve that. And there's also a controversy around where that can best be achieved and where it is seen as a plausible alternative to current land uses, because not all people are happy with the idea of living in a forest when they have been living in an agricultural landscape all their lives. This affects people's identities, people's values, people's culture. It's very, very important to have participatory engagement methods to make sure that we actually interact with the local communities and get them on board. Because we cannot just go there and plant trees and think that's going to be fine. We need to actually work with community initiatives and all the community groups to identify where we can do this. So the third pillar here is to use 10% of farmland for agroforestry. Agroforestry historically had a period of time when it was actually in decline. So we need to reverse that decline and actually get agroforestry on the agenda much more. There are some very enthusiastic demonstration farms who are promoting agroforestry as new farming techniques in the UK. But the question is actually, what incentives does the UK need to provide to encourage farmers to adopt those practices? And how can we actually get buy-in into those schemes? In the UK, there is historically a big use of hedgerows. Many of the fields have hedgerows, and those are classed as agroforestry under some definitions. But now also there is silver pasture as one of the main aspects where the sheep in the pasture basically can be protected from extreme sun radiation and heat during heat waves by having isolated trees on pasture. And that can also play a role in agroforestry expansion. Fourth pillar is about restoration of peatland. And this report found 55% of peatland needs to be restored by 2050 to get us on the net zero path that is needed here. Ruminant emissions of methane are mentioned, and peatlands are the second major source of emissions in the UK. The UK has a large number of peatlands, a big area of peatlands. Some of those are in the uplands, some of them are in the lowlands. So, you know, through your Changing the Environment program shown how important the lowland peatlands are for the greenhouse gas balance, but also what a complicated nexus it is, what to do with those peatlands. Because they've been drained historically for agriculture. They constitute the most productive agricultural soils in the UK, and that use something like between 35 and 40% of potatoes and vegetables. So we cannot just stop producing all this food. Now, there's been a task force by the UK government recently reporting on lowland peatlands, and they made a number of recommendations, including rewarding farmers for moving to a raised water table, wetter kind of agriculture. Although the devil is in the detail how you achieve that, because the water table is highly regulated in so many of the lowland areas. And it is not possible for a farmer to decide to raise the water table only in one field. That is not very effective. So it has to be a regional integrated approach how these peatlands can be managed in a way to reduce some of those emissions. At the University of Leicester, we have got a research project on the go. We are developing a self-learning digital twin technology to try and help the decision-making around ruminant emissions and peatlands, together with the universities of Loughborough and Bristol. So the fifth pillar is the increased use of land for energy crops. We heard about energy crops before. And the plan here would be to go to 23,000 hectares of energy crops. Now, that's a big area. And the question again is, where do we actually plant all this stuff? And then in the grey box there, behavior change is one of the recommendations from the Climate Change Committee. And there's an item here on changing diets, reducing our consumption of beef and lamb and dairy products by 20% per head by 2050. That's a highly contentious political issue in the UK, because a lot of people feel this is infringing on their personal freedoms if they're being told what they can and cannot eat. And it also is controversial as a policy idea, because the farmer still has the choice to export beef and dairy products if there's no domestic market anymore. So we are in a global market, and it's not enough just to change the diet in one place in the world if consumption is going up everywhere else and the prices are high. So how to reach that behavior change, I think, is a big question mark. And the reduction of food waste by 20% by 2030 is another pillar of those recommendations. Now, the policy commitments that are actually in place are listed on this slide here, and I'm not going to read them out, but they focus on some of the main features of the previous recommendations. Policy commitments are essentially to increase woodland cover, to restore peatlands, to scale up bioenergy co-production, and to protect 30% of land for nature by 2030, as is expected under the Montreal Protocol. Now, this report on multifunctional landscapes came out in about a year or two ago by the Royal Society. And it actually highlights the need for multifunctional landscapes. Why did it highlight this as a finding? Now, it highlighted this because when you sum up all the area requirements of all the different policies that are in place in the UK, we need more land. We don't have a big enough land area to deliver all the policy goals that are already an agreed policy and enshrined in law. So therefore, we cannot deliver on all the policy objectives. if we have a parcel of land for food production, a different area for peatland protection, another area for biodiversity promotion. We need to develop landscapes that can deliver multiple of these benefits in order to achieve our policy goals. So therefore, that really highlights the need for thinking about the co-benefits, and I still use that term, co-benefits, of multifunctional landscapes. And the term co-benefits to me indicates that there is a primary policy driver that has some additional benefits. So land use options towards net zero must be designed in the form of multifunctional landscapes. I think it is a mistake to just make a landscape decision process with a single objective. There will be some trade-offs and the loss of some ecosystem services to create others. So whatever policy option we choose, peatland restoration is one of the examples. We also have to be open about the loss of potential other ecosystem services that comes with the change in land use. I think it is important to be honest about this and actually quantify both the benefits, but also the trade-offs that we have to basically accept if we want to go for those options. Co-benefits of climate action can be realized for nature and people. And I've put on this slide basically that, of course, the net zero land use interventions interact with social, economic, and health benefits of the local communities. They interact with the biodiversity benefits and can help actually protect and restore biodiversity. And if we get it right, we can design landscape decisions and land use change processes in the UK and worldwide that can actually achieve multiple different policy outcomes at the same time, provided we understand what the interactions between all these different outcomes are and how we can best achieve them. So there's been a food for thought. It's not been a very technical talk, but hopefully you found it inspiring. Thank you.
Thank you. Right. So I suggest now that actually we can get together for some questions. I'm going to grab one more chair here. I know that we've got people in the audience, so I want you to bring this one. The panelists would come to the front. That would be really helpful. Could I also encourage? So I've got a few questions, but actually I would also encourage panelists to also ask some of your other panelists questions as well, because I'm sure that you may have had some stimulation as a result of what you've heard, and so don't just think of yourself as in the position of answering questions. It's quite nice asking questions as well sometimes. So I'm going to start, if that's okay. Just going to start with one question, and it's one that's dear to my heart, and it's to do with risks. So actually, it was really for you, Heiko, to start with, but others please chip in. If we're asking first of all, identifying the issues regarding emissions, and I'm going to take peat as an example. They've been drained for a long time, as you've said, and as a result of the drainage, we're losing the peat. So this is an asset that the farmers are losing, and at some point they're going to get basically lose that topsoil or lose the peat, and they're going to be left with a very different place in which they're going to be trying to grow crops, or perhaps they won't be able to. But clearly, by raising the water table, yes, it can have reduce emissions, but there are increased risks of loss of crops when, for example, you're increasing the risk of a flooding event in terms of adverse weather conditions and just being not as able to cope with that. So there's a risk associated with it, and there are different timescales associated with these risks. How do we manage that in terms of and communicate this and help farmers get their head around this? And is it something that we need to share as a broader society? Because you've said 30–40% of our food comes from the fens. Therefore, we have a collective responsibility, do we not? How do we navigate that?
Thank you. Thank you for that question. Is the microphone?
Yep.
Okay, good. Now, how do we manage the risks? My first message would be to think long term and not think short term. So we clearly do have to communicate that basically if we keep going with our agricultural model peatlands that are drained as we do now in the UK, those peatlands will be completely oxidized and gone at some point. You know, you can argue about whether that's going to be 50 years time or 70 or 100 years time, but we're losing the peat soil. So why not keep the carbon in the soil to begin with? And the other important focus here, I think, needs to be on actually thinking about the links between climate mitigation and climate adaptation. And that, I think, will move up the policy agenda. Historically, mitigation and adaptation policies have been somewhat decoupled in the political debates, but also, I think, in the research community, we have not thought enough, I think, about how we can bring them together. When it comes to land use, I think it is very, very clear, as came out in some of the other talks as well, that we need to think about the sustainability of land use interventions and also the time window we still have to use the land as a sink for carbon, because that time will be gone at some point. If the temperatures go up too much and if the climate has changed too much, we are losing those intervention possibilities, because then under those climatic conditions, there are big areas of land where trees can't grow anymore, for example. So my point would be to try and think in terms of the linkages between climate scenarios, climate adaptation, climate mitigation, and also communicate what the risks are of keeping going as a business as usual, as is currently the case, because that is not without risks either. So we need to quantify both risks, I think, of an intervention, but also of not having an intervention and carrying on.
Great. Does anyone else want to comment? Elena, yes.
That's a really good question. And talking about the Brazilian case, Brazilian agriculture really relies on ecosystem services. Around 90% of the lands rely on rainfed. So then if we have not a stable climate, and if we have disruptions, if we have problems with water cycle, climate, higher temperatures, what's going to happen? Brazilian agriculture will suffer, and Brazil is a global producer and exporter. So it will also affect the whole world, not only locally. And what is on the table in terms of policies for the Brazilian agriculture, there is a plan, a low carbon emissions plan called Plan ABC plan. That's more for adaptation, in my opinion, than for mitigation. It's hard to mitigate emissions from the agricultural sector. So in the Brazilian case particularly, it's important to protect and restore, to keep the ecosystem services, to adapt, to continue producing in the future, and also push for these policies on the land use side. But we also need more investments on this policy. So far, Brazil is in a process of reconstruction after 4 years of a very difficult times, let's say. And then it's all like reconstructing policies. I have numbers from the previous government. So last year of previous government, only 2% of the money for low carbon emissions adaptation in agriculture was only less than 2%. We need to scale up this as well. So finance money for sustainable practices in agriculture. But again, protection, restoration, the role of NBS for mitigation in Brazil is big, but also for adaptation and resilience.
Okay. Any questions from the audience? I will take a question from the back. Be kind enough to give your name and affiliation, please. Can we get a microphone, please? We are recording, so
okay.
As long as you're okay about that.
Yeah, good. You told them, so I don't say I'm too bad. Good morning. My name is Shata Klebering. I lead the Climate Positive Energy Initiative at the University of Toronto. I have a follow-up quick question for you about Brazil. So you said only 2% is going towards low emission agriculture. So where is the other 98% going to? Is it mostly like mining, because Brazil is big on mining, so they are trying to clean up the mining processes? Where is the money going for low carbon emission processes?
Yeah, so working on. I was specifically talking about money for agriculture. So there is a budget for agricultural practices. It's called Plano Safra. And from previous, like last year, only 2% or less than 2% of this money for agriculture was going to sustainable practices that are important for adaptation and resilience. The 98% was going for conventional agriculture, monoculture, soybeans, cattle ranching. So we need to create more policies to incentivize more sustainable practices. But another point to reinforce, agriculture is not going to be the sector to become a sink in the future. It's hard to abate. It's hard to reduce emissions from agriculture. The best way is through protecting, restoring, so implementing nature-based solutions, especially in the Brazilian case, and living less not prioritizing in the Brazilian case, not prioritizing bags because it's costly. It requires land, which increases the competition. We are talking about land in the climate problem. More bags means more competition for land, for protection, restoration, food protection, and also this land for biocrops, for energy as well.
Good. Any other questions from the audience? No, I've got a question which is probably for So Young and maybe Olivia as well. What are the challenges associated with building up the infrastructure for BECCS?
Sure. I think there would be two things for the challenges. First of all, that would be setting the standards for. It's on. Okay, sorry.
Yeah.
So last year there was a proposal from the EU Commission that there should be a carbon removal certification framework. So that was proposed, and it includes sustainability aspect of it. So that would be biodiversity and the land use. And so they're specifically looking at how we can preserve those values while accelerating BECCS and direct agriculture on the side note. So that is being proposed and accepted by the parliament last month. But in other countries where bioenergy is highly prevalent, we don't have much governance system on it. So that would be a challenge to going forward about how we will manage those risks. And the second thing would be the storage. I mentioned briefly about carbon storage, and bioenergy plants were not built to be BECCS plants, so they don't have storage site nearby in most cases. So thinking about how we will deliver all those capture carbon to geological reservoirs is a challenge for sure, and adding cost to the current base value to it. And so we will need to think about how we will utilize the existing industrial clusters and looking at specific bioenergy plants and combining the capture carbon flows from other industrial facilities. So that would be to help us to lower the cost and also the risk as well. Do you have anything?
Okay, great. So I've got a follow-up question, if you don't mind. This is probably everybody on the panel. So it goes beyond BECCS, but it's a similar issue, which is to do with standards. And if we go to a world where there are trading of carbon credits, for example, and those credits being of not just removals, but also emissions reduction, given all the extra layers and all the different flavors that we're going to talk about regarding nature-based solutions, the way that these may well work is that different jurisdictions will have different standards. So, and for example, the value of biodiversity versus just the carbon and all of these other aspects. How do you see sort of navigating this forward in terms of on a market basis for, let's call it just carbon credits to start with, but factoring all of the other really important aspects that have been discussed this morning, how that then gets compared and traded? So we'd like to go with that first.
About BECCS aspect, there is some IPCC guidelines on LULUCF and also some on herbaceous products but there is no comprehensive guidelines on standards for facts. So that as to the accounting issues of it, Olivia can talk more about the Article 6.4 standards that is being proposed by the board. But I believe there is no international governance system for managing the standards. So that is being requested by many parties for updating the IPCC guidelines, but the progress has been quite slow, and especially cross-border accounting is even more tricky when we think about exporting biomass to other countries for capturing for bioenergy, and also transporting CO2 for storage in the other location. And all these elements are adding complexity to the issue.
Anyone else to comment? Okay.
Yeah, I think the issue about multifunctionality in landscapes is a really tricky one in that context, because the trading schemes and certifications are generally for one outcome.
Exactly.
So they go against that principle of multifunctionality. So a farmer is quite often, I think, in a situation where they have to decide, am I going to set aside land for biodiversity credits or for some outcomes in that field, or am I going to use the same parcel of land and claim some carbon credits? And currently, it's almost impossible, if not entirely impossible, for a farmer to say, I'm going to manage my entire farmland in a way that increases everything a little bit, and I'm going to claim benefits from that. So there is still work to be done, I think, how we quantify all the multiple different outcomes and how that can be actually certified, because then the certification problem becomes hellishly complex. But I think it would be an ideal outcome if we could actually link the different policies, link the Convention on Biodiversity with the Convention on Climate Change, and link all the various different outcomes of land use. Because then, as a farmer, I think you have a sense of achieving something from multiple different policy outcomes. And if there are reward mechanisms in place, that can actually start incentivizing the land use change that we need to see.
Okay. Anyone else? Audrey, yes.
You completely agree with what you've just said. Okay, assuming that we are going the carbon credit route, I think that there could be benefits to looking at smaller, more localized, more tailored carbon credit schemes compared to, instead of selling selling credits on the global market, which become almost indiscriminate. There are, for instance, different kind of companies or initiatives in the UK. One, I think it's called Wilder Carbon, and it is, I think, through the Wildlife Trust. What they're doing is that they're doing a small number of transactions on and really focusing on quality. So they're the product, I guess, that they're selling is, is at a high premium price, has all these kind of different benefits, and they're selling it to buyers who are specifically interested in very, very high quality credits that have all the different benefits, not just the carbon, so high biodiversity, etc. And what they're also doing is that they're vetting the buyers. So not only are the buyers vetting the credits that they're buying, but the actual, they will refuse to sell credits to companies who they see as using the credits for greenwashing, companies who are not decarbonizing as fast and as much as they should. So really kind of close relationships between the buyer and the sellers, and full transparency. And this is kind of done on, again, it works on a small scale, but once you get up to the kind of big global scale where everything is kind of eclipsed and a credit is just a credit and we don't know where it's come from, that's where I think a lot of problems come in.
Okay, so I mean that's quite a challenge, given that there are aggregators sort of moving in this space, and in terms of sort of trying to provide these sorts of platforms. Any other questions from the audience? Okay, I have another one then, which is to do with timescales. And it's so if I look at not only timescales associated with the level of permanence, but actually the timescales of an action and when that sequestration, that it's going to be, if we're talking about carbon credits, when that or an emissions reduction, when that will actually start to have an impact. And yet we've got other approaches, non-nature-based solutions, for example, such as direct air capture, it's much easier sometimes to be able to at least identify the timescales, and they're often shorter. Once the plant's been built, you can say, right, here's an action. We're going to be able to measure that as well. How do we sort of navigate that with some of our nature-based solutions, and which ones would you think are the most challenging, and which ones are less challenging in terms of nature-based solutions towards this? I'd like to go for that.
I guess I would focus my response a bit more on the permanence aspect of it, because that's more kind of what I've looked into in my experience. So, and really kind of what we do is we take the framing of risk of reversal, and so we really kind of try to frame permanence as risk, and looking at kind of what are the different risks for each intervention, the level of risks, the uncertainty, and how will that then translate into different kind of levels of potential permanence, and what actions can be taken to minimize those risks, I guess, as I presented.
Okay, Mohammed, would you have a comment as well?
So in the annual reports for Canada's emissions, there is the carbon budget model, which looks at understanding the data sources for including land use change, and how they can predict how the land use change would contribute to emissions down the line. And a clear example is how the carbon sink scenario switched to a carbon source based on a revitalization of the data they were using. So I think we also have another example of the 2 billion trees project by Trudeau. And the idea is we set a timeline, we have a policy in place based on the predicted outcomes from a model scenario, or what we anticipate the model scenario to look like. But then when we revisit the data, we find that it's falling short, or maybe in optimistic scenarios, it's actually overperforming. So I feel that the way to gauge a timeline and its effectiveness, especially for nature-based solutions, is to really look at data and understanding from experiences of not only local communities or the federal or provincial level, but also across borders.
Okay. Name and affiliation for that, please.
Hugh Hunt, Cambridge University Centre for Time Compared. I just want to press that question further, because I think it's pretty important. We're going to lose Arctic ice in 10 years, 20 years. Glaciers are vanishing. The timescale for these things is 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. So I'm just going to press that question a bit more. Is there a view from the panel that the land use changes and deforestation and so on can have an impact on, say, Arctic ice and glacier melting on a time scale that will make a difference?
Okay. Heiko.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, you are on. Yeah.
Thank you for that question. I think globally we saw that land use change and forestry are one of the main sources of emissions. I guess that we can do something about. At COP26 in Glasgow, we saw the Glasgow leaders' commitment to end deforestation by 2030. So that's a timescale that maps onto the timescale we're talking about for the Arctic sea ice loss. Now, how do we actually achieve that? I was in a session yesterday that talked about have we met or have we not met our commitments in Glasgow worldwide. And the view was that the world has probably met its commitments financially. So the finance flow is beginning to flow as intended. But what we have not achieved worldwide yet is to really reduce deforestation levels. Quite to the contrary, that actually increased right now. So over the last 2 years, we have somehow put a lot of money into it, but I think the trend is not materializing yet. I think there's still too much forest being lost. And an example how we can implement this, I want to give you is from my own work with the Kenya Forest Service. I was in the Kenya Pavilion yesterday for another event. We have worked with the University of Leicester and the Kenya Forest Service for more than 10 years now on developing a forest alert system from satellite that basically gives the ranger in the field access to information where a tree is being cut down within 24 hours after the satellite takes the image. And the way we have done this is by really listening to the rangers, because they have very basic technology. They do not have computers in the field stations. They do not have Wi-Fi. They use a mobile phone with a personal data allowance, which is really expensive in Kenya. And therefore, they wanted only the latitude, longitude, geographic coordinate of where something is being detected. They were not interested in the gigabytes of satellite data we were processing. And we managed to boil down the information to that level, get it screened by someone in the Kenya Forest Service central office in the GIS team, and they can then delegate to the rangers, go and investigate this alert. What I heard yesterday in the Kenya Pavilion was that led to a reduction of illegal logging cases in the 5 counties where the system has been applied now for a number of years by as much as 70%. Because people have been arrested when they were cutting down trees illegally. And word gets around in the local communities that they're being watched from space and they cannot get away with it anymore. So it can be very effective, I think, to use technology for strengthening governance. But the political will also needs to be there. So I think it's a combination of different factors. The political sphere is really important. I'm thinking about the Brazilian case and the deforestation rates especially. But there's a technology solution also that we can provide to meet those timescales.
Of the net zero timescales, for example. Audrey, sorry, Eleni, sorry.
Yeah, I would like to add on your words. If deforestation was a country, it would be the 3rd largest emitter. And in Brazil, in the Brazilian case, in countries with high forest, low fossil fuel emissions from deforestation, they are higher. But we know the elephant in the room is fossil fuel emissions. That's why we need to phase out of full, fast, parent-funded fossil fuels for sure. We need that. But we have to remember that it's not only carbon. We also have a biodiversity crisis happening. And our life on land depends on the balance of our ecosystems. So this is super important. And I just want to add that the energy transition we need should happen in a way it doesn't destroy our planet, it doesn't harm nature. And a planet that reaches the Paris Agreement target but destroys biodiversity is equally inhabitable.
Great. Right, one more comment. So yeah, from Audrey, if you want to talk for Mohammed.
The idea of the warming, melting the Arctic, it also affects the nature itself. So it applies stromatal stress, and it prevents the trees or the biosphere from being as productive in photosynthesis. So in effect, as the global temperatures rise, there is an indication from research that says that the ratio of photosynthesis to respiration would go down. So in effect, nature would actually accelerate this further. So the idea is, regardless of how many solutions we use, the timeline is actually shorter for us rather than that 10-year timeline for total melting.
Right. Okay. Well, I think we need to draw things to a close here so that the next session can prepare. I want to thank our panelists this morning. It is Food and Water Day, and therefore it's a really, really helpful start to that, to be able to think about how we might be able to help landscapes, help the climate. But of course, we can't just think in terms of just carbon. There are lots of other factors, and feeding the planet and feeding the people, and all biodiversity and all of the other factors that have been laid out that you started with, Audrey, are extremely important for us. One big takeaway for me, I really love the alliteration today, with COP28 and the fair, the fast, the fundable. And actually, if you don't read it, but if you say it, and the phase out, I really enjoyed that too. I might actually start using it myself but spelling the phase out with an F instead of PH correct, because I really enjoyed it. But I want to thank our panelists for a really stimulating morning. Thanks ever so much indeed.